So welcome to our session with the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Thanks very much indeed. I've had to ask you just to settle down. The way we'll run this is I'll ask some questions, and then towards the end we'll have some questions from you. And if you'd wait for the microphone before you put your question. So may I introduce you to the UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights, who is Prince Zeid bin Ra'ab Al Hussein, who took up his post in 2014. He knew what he was doing because he was instrumental in developing the International Criminal Court. He was chosen to be president of the Assembly of State Parties as that court was being formed. He was educated in the United Kingdom, in the United States. He was in the Desert Police, which is a wonderful story that we won't have time for. And if it's correct, I read that he's in line for the throne of Iraq, which must surely come into the category of be careful what you wish for. Prince, Commissioner, thank you very much indeed. I was going to say that, of course, it would be very easy for me as a journalist to go through the list of horrible human rights abuses that the world is observing and that make headlines, and some, far too many, that don't make headlines, and say to the Commissioner, so what are you doing and why isn't it working? I don't think that will be helpful. There are some of those, and I will ask some of those questions, but I wanted to give you the opportunity first, Commissioner, just to talk about these instruments, because the overwhelming theme of this forum is to collaborate, to invigorate the instruments by which the world cooperates to solve its problems. Where do you fit in?
Dan, thank you for, first of all, that warm welcome. It's always good to be reminded of what one has done in the past, and you pronounced my name correctly. Because in the UN, I am still unknown. The cables that are sent between Geneva and New York refer to me as Zeid al-Hussein, sometimes just al-Hussein. Someone once called me Alfred Hussein. I'm not Alfred. And then there's sometimes I'm Hussein, and sometimes I'm just Zeid. And at one stage I was in Brussels, and a Danish journalist came up to me, and she tapped me on the shoulder, and she said, "Excuse me, who are you?" And I turned around and I said, I really have no clue who I am. I have an identity crisis. So anyway, it's good to be reminded by you. Look, if I begin with this central proposition, that were it not for 2 world wars and the deaths of about 100 million people, if you factor in also the deaths from the great influenza epidemic, we wouldn't have the human rights machinery that we have in place. In other words, human reason alone would not have been sufficient to convert custom or customary law into conventions, into codified treaties. It took the enormous suffering of the European continent and the Far East, and the European continent twice in one generation, to stir the human condition into producing the 2 international covenants, of course, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 2 international covenants, and then the core human rights treaties that we have in place. And that energy now has been dissipating over 70 years. And so we find a sort of half-hearted commitment to these treaties by those states who really should know better. Because once you unwind them, once you start stripping them, once you're cutting corners, once you start justifying to yourself why it's okay to torture, why it's okay to undertake surveillance without court orders, why you can turn and avert your gaze when another country is clearly committing offenses which would rise to a violation of superior law, jus cogens. This then is a fast downhill spiral into the abyss, and we are now in a moment of great struggle. We cannot take these rights for granted. I don't come from a human rights background. I came straight out of the UN Security Council, and before that I had worked in peace building. I had been a peacekeeper once myself, and I had worked in international justice and international development. And for people who cast or present human rights as a sort of esoteric activity of a few lawyers, hard to understand, very technical, really don't understand then the world that we live in. The seismograph for human rights monitoring is so sensitive that often we are the ones that are bringing to the attention of the rest of the UN system where we perceive problems to be. And it's not others. Others may have their tentacles spread further, the humanitarian actors, but we're the ones who will speak out. We feed this information to the Human Rights Council, to the Security Council. We have the committees which will monitor the implementation of the core treaties. And then we have special procedures, experts, working groups, comprising experts that will review petitions and the development in terms of the obligations attendant on states and the need to uphold them. And also, I should just quickly mention this so that people know. When a country, a state, accedes to a particular treaty, it takes upon itself obligations. In the past, reservations were also included. Over time, we are hoping that these reservations are the trend towards the removal of them. If you don't exceed, you don't have the obligations, but you have to respect the standard. And that's what we often need to make plain to governments. So it's a bit of a long-winded response.
It's a good response. How do you gather your information? I'm sure you'd like to have squads of blue helicopters and blue-clad SWAT teams that could go down into human rights crises. You don't have that. How do you get your information?
Well, we work closely with civil society, with national human rights institutions, ombuds offices. We work also with the international press. We have to corroborate everything we receive. Depending on what mechanism we have, we have to be extremely careful about where we source the information. We have 66 presences around the world. So I think we're practically in every conflict situation. The difference in the UN context, I think when you compare us to the two other pillars of the UN, peace and security and development, is that we are really global. I mean, peace and security and development is fundamentally in the global south. And you can add humanitarian action as well. And it's only the human rights pillar that is really not north, south, east, or west. We look at all 193 states. And that qualitatively makes it quite different for us. The amazing thing is that we only occupy 3% of the UN budget, which is telling, really. It's not by dint of some sort of accident. And I've often raised whether there is a real commitment to human rights if it's maintained at 3%. And as I often say, the Swiss spend 10 times more on chocolate every year than we have as a budget.
There's a cynicism about the human rights instruments and institutions generally in the north, in the northern hemisphere. What about in the south?
Well, I think there's a greater appreciation. We do a lot of work behind the scenes to convince governments to release prisoners who are arbitrarily detained. I think we have a good record of success preventing executions when we have made a direct appeal to the head of state. It doesn't always work, but in general, I think the majority of times the execution is halted. We fight for access whenever we can, whenever we're given the opportunity. And often it's denied to us, and what we say to governments is, you claim everything's okay, you claim the violations are all on the side of the rebels or the opposition or whoever, well, let us in. Why are you hiding? What are you hiding? And I am afraid many of their arguments are just not credible. Some will say to us, we can't let you in because it's a dangerous security environment. The response is that we are in Yemen, we're in Iraq, where we have teams covering all these conflict areas, so we can make that decision of how insecure or secure it is. But access is something we fight for.
Let's talk about Donald Trump. We must, because he's keeping me and many other journalists in a living currently. You made some very interesting headline-grabbing comments about Donald Trump, roughly that he was recklessly driving the bus of humanity down a mountain road. What did you mean? And bearing in mind what you said about budget, was it wise?
Yes, it was wise, because it has to be said. We all feel it. There's a capriciousness in the way the president seems to operate, which leaves us very unsettled. After the Charlottesville, the terrible scenes, because we have long believed that these sorts of expressions of anti-Semitism and hatred and racism had more or less disappeared to fringe elements. But clearly in the chat rooms of the internet, they're bubbling again, and now they've burst out into the open. And it's extremely dangerous. One fights for the right, of course, to have freedom of expression. But there is also, it's not unlimited, there is, of course, incitement to hatred and violence. And this is clearly defined in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And once you've clearly crossed over to an incitement, then this needs to be roundly condemned, and the president didn't seem to roundly condemn it. And it was the equivocation which caused much concern. The position of President of the United States is too important, too powerful. The office requires a dignity for others to respect it. And if you play loose and fast with that dignity, then the power correspondingly becomes much more difficult to uphold, and in fast-moving situations can be recklessly applied. I believed before he was elected president that he could be a dangerous president, and I still would maintain that that's the case. And I think, as I said in the press conference last week, there's only one person who can confirm this to all of us, and that is the president himself. And he seems, alas, to be doing that.
What are the dangers? You know, what's going to happen on the mountain road as he drives down?
Well, there are quite a few that are of great concern. One is the state of race relations in the United States is compounded by the vacillation when it comes to demonstrations of racism, as we saw in Charlottesville. And it doesn't take much imagination to imagine a situation where 2 or 3 young African-American youth are shot by white police officers, as has been the case over the last few years. And one tweet in the wrong direction by the president could send the country back into a situation where it wouldn't be just the equivalent of the Watts riots and the riots in 1968, because now there is a body of opinion which holds that racism is somehow acceptable. And the danger is, people will say to me, why focus on the United States and many other problems around the world? But we know that many countries mimic those countries that have long upheld certain values. And if there's a derogation, or if there's a lessening of commitment, then the situation becomes much worse in those other countries, and we saw it with Cambodia. The president makes it a habit of attacking, almost by person, attacking members of the press corps in the US. I find that very disturbing. The right to freedom of expression, the right to a free press is guaranteed under the Constitution, but acts of intimidation like this sort, of this sort, lead to a particular sequence, and that begins usually with self-censorship, and then you have basically a curtailment of the needed check on power by the media. And the end result, of course, is you find yourself in a completely terrible space if the media doesn't defend itself, and if people like me don't defend the media. But I saw in Cambodia then a few days afterwards, there was the government was using President Trump's words to suspend the licenses of various radio stations and curtail the media in Cambodia. And so it's for that precise reason why it's so important to discuss these issues.
Of course, that leads to, I think, what's described as whataboutism. You know, here you are speaking harshly about the United States, and those who support Donald Trump, some who don't, would say, yes, but what about North Korea? Shouldn't you be banging on about North Korea? The United States at least has a free press, freer, no ball coming, freer than your own country, Jordan. Is there not a choice of words that you should have made?
No, it's because it's only a casual review of what we've said in my office will demonstrate that we have spoken time and again about all these issues. And I would challenge you to give me an example where we really needed to speak. I can think of only two, but I'm going to open my account with those countries next week. I have a statement on Monday, and those two countries are going to fall under my spyglass. But there are only two that stand out for me. I don't think there's a situation where we haven't opined. And what are we doing? We're holding up a mirror to those countries. I don't accept this idea that we're naming and shaming. The country that tortures its own citizens, the country that engages in arbitrary detentions and forced disappearances, they've already shamed themselves, and we hold up a mirror to their practice. We can always debate whether the facts are right or wrong, and we do it. And where we make a mistake, I acknowledge we make a mistake. In June, I made a mistake in respect of two countries, Nigeria and Australia, and I apologize to the two governments. We're not sanctimonious to a point where we say we have saintly qualities and we can divine the truth. We will get it wrong. But the idea that, you know, there was a ridiculous comment where they said something like, you know, the High Commissioner is attacking the president. Who is he to attack the president? Why doesn't he say something about Venezuela? When in actual fact, the press conference was about Venezuela. And we released a report on Venezuela. And then two journalists asked me about the US, as you just did, and I responded. So it's just a matter of paying attention. The idea that I've excluded, defended, protected any country, at least my own, I think can be borne out by the facts themselves.
Let's talk about one of the headline-grabbing human rights crises at the moment, and that is the Rakhine State in Myanmar, where we have apparently a Nobel laureate at least acquiescing in the brutal murder of people who are trying to flee a war. What's your Commission's policy? How will you now try to intervene?
Well, when the first attack on a border post occurred back in November of last year, I requested from the government that we be given access to that part of Rakhine because the news was dire in the extreme and we needed to verify this. After a period of about 2 to 3 weeks, I heard nothing from the government. Aung San Suu Kyi was on a visit to Singapore. And so I sent a team of investigators to Cox's Bazar. The Bangladeshi government gave us access. And we interviewed many of those who had escaped from Rakhine. And what they painted was the most appalling. I mean, we are so used to reading graphic, horrific accounts, but this was equal to anything I've seen from ISIS or Daesh in Syria or Iraq. It was so horrific. I spoke to her by phone when the report was released in January. And I appealed to her, knowing that there was a constitutional limit on what she can do. But I appealed to her as someone who has standing in the country with the generals to stop this. After an initial exchange, and she said, she gave me the indication that she would endeavor to do this, it seemed to be quite clear that nothing was happening. It ended up in a sort of low intensity. We still saw people crossing the border. And we said early on, I released a press release in February saying, if they don't settle these issues of deep discrimination and act quickly, it's predictable what's going to happen. So what happened a couple of weeks ago was absolutely no surprise to me. And now the numbers have come across 123,000 since the start of the crisis, is almost equal to the entire number of people who've crossed over to Europe in 2017. So the situation in Bangladesh is precarious, and we also need many in the international community to assist Bangladesh. To my mind, I simply cannot understand what Aung San Suu Kyi is thinking. If she has no effective power, if I were in her position, I would resign. Either there's effective power or there's no effective power, but to be somehow associated with these events, I think is extremely problematic. And yes, I'm not saying that this Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army isn't responsible for atrocities. They probably are. But the pattern that we've seen on the part of the military and some of the sort of irregulars, let's say those drawn from the Rakhine minority community, I believe, be responsible for the majority of what we're seeing. And I don't know, I couldn't be in her position. I would have to stand down if I couldn't exercise any effective power of some sort, moral, emotional, whatever it is. But this has to stop. I mean, it's frightful.
So why don't we, as members of the United Nations, why don't we have the mechanisms to intervene more quickly? You're making statements, and they're very important statements, and they will echo, but the ability to pull together nations that have trading relationships with Myanmar, for example, that's a very slow process, and it's been slow. It seems to be getting slower.
Well, in March, I believe it was, I called for the setting up of a fact-finding mission. It has been established. It's led by a very distinguished Indonesian expert on human rights. We know that there's a discussion between the fact-finding mission and the government. They seek access to Rakhine, and we hope that the government will allow the mission in. It is true that you have to build coalitions. The problem, Dan, is that it is overwhelming. What we're seeing now is overwhelming. I mean, we have a near genocidal situation in Southeast Central African Republic. We see what's happening in Yemen. We see areas of tension in the Sahel, of course. The situation in Mali, very disturbing. Libya, of course, very worrying. We see what's happening in Venezuela. And when you still have then the frozen conflicts and beyond that, and then we still, of course, Ukraine, the UN alone cannot simply carry the entire load. You know, why, when we began to see Venezuela go awry, was it only practically myself and Washington that was saying something, and the Spanish Prime Minister said it, made a few comments. No one else wanted to talk about it. It is true that you have trading relationships, but in the end, if we don't have a stable world, if everything is falling apart, you know, to hang your hat on the notion that somehow this world is unbreakable is completely flawed thinking. It is perfectly breakable. We've broken it before, and we can easily break it again. And this is what worries me most. I mean, I'll just give you an example. We had a discussion the other day about the internet and about the power of these large IT companies. And, you know, were they not now reaching points where they form trusts and these must be broken? But I had to point out that what is the underlying assumption that holds that the internet is a given thing? There have been many who have opined that we're quite possibly going toward a splinternet or a complete destruction of the internet, right? And then what of these companies? They become worthless, right? The very underlying condition which keeps the world together is beginning to fray. We can't make the assumption that just because our lives depend on it, no one's going to be stupid enough to ruin it for us. Because if we go back to June of 1914, and you asked bankers in Western Europe, ship owners in Western Europe, traders, you asked scientists, you said to them, is it possible that we're going to have a general European war? They would have all said impossible. Yes, there were the difficult situations in the Balkans, the two Balkan wars. We had the Moroccan crisis. But it didn't serve humanity to have the world plunged into this, because economies were growing rapidly in the industrialized world. Much of it, of course, on a colonialism which was pernicious. But it wasn't in the interest. To make the argument somehow the internet is going to last, well, that's not quite the case. And if you're really paying attention, you look at the human rights conditions, because civil society is being destroyed in many countries. Destroyed. And with it, journalism, with it, the legal profession, with it, courts, and we'll find ourselves in the most appalling situation. I know you said don't make it depressing. And I'm trying not to, because I want to be brazen about this. And I think in a UN context, I've served so many years in the UN, my good friend Ernst Petrich, we were together as ambassadors in New York, and we know what diplomatic speak is. You know, we all think things, but we don't say it publicly, except for Ernst. He would often speak publicly, which is very refreshing. So I'm using him as my model here for outspokenness. But we have to speak. We have to speak about these issues. And by doing so, then you see, it's not just officials, but people. And the way that people have galvanized and repudiating what we see in terms of the sort of ideologies of the extreme. And they don't want to go there, as was said yesterday. And I think that's encouraging.
Yes, you said don't be depressing and don't be despairing. I think you probably cannot be despairing, otherwise you wouldn't turn up for work, would you? Looking at that catalogue, and that was a very small part of a long list. You dedicated much of your life, professional life, to strengthening the instruments that are supposed to help us cope with these abuses, these crises, these conflicts. What's the latest thinking on one of those instruments, which is the responsibility to protect? I went to The Hague to talk to law professors about 10 years ago. They were very excited. The ICC gave them the idea that governments, leaders, would recognize the responsibility to protect their citizens. That's kind of got lost. What needs to be done to bring that back to the global agenda?
Yeah, it's an extremely difficult position for me, point for me to answer, because my office is fully behind the responsibility to protect. But I personally was never really convinced early on, because I didn't think the norm could be driven by declarations. The norm had to be driven by practice. And if the practice was commonplace, then there would be no need to come out with a declaration, because it was commonplace that you activate a series of mechanisms to address the issue through mediation, quiet diplomacy, and so forth. And at the very extreme, you'd have to step in. But I was worried that by coming out with the declarations, and there manifestly being before you situations where intervention was warranted and nothing took place, it would render the whole notion of responsibility to protect weak. But I understand how we need to encourage governments to see this as a planet where we all have a stake. I mean, the central lesson of the two world wars, in my opinion, is that if you're scrambling about just for what is important to you, you scramble it for everyone. If you're scrambling about on behalf of everyone, right, you make this planet safer. And the danger is the narrow, razor-sharp thinking of the thin philosophies are present, and that's why this struggle needs to be engaged.
You mean isolationism, better keep people out than integrate them, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think the politics of identity and exclusion are there. It's very clear when you look at the work the pitiless, merciless, cruel work of the terrorists that after the trigger is pulled, the pedal is pressed, the ripcord is pulled, they sit back and they watch these societies begin to destroy themselves. And it's precisely because of the way that the many governments react that they give grist to the recruitment of those who are lost to find their way to these extremist groups. I mean, I'll give you an example. When you arbitrarily, when you arrest someone on account of activities related to terrorism, and clearly the person has nothing to do with a terrorist group, it could be a lawyer or a journalist who's a liberal in an authoritarian state, and you tell that person you could be well charged on the basis of the Counterterrorism Act, and you put that person in prison. Well, it's not one person who you are about to alienate even deeper. It could be 10 members of their family, another 20 members of the community, and from that, how many are going to then cross to the other side? It's a self-defeating proposition. We came out with a report on countering Boko Haram. This was about 2 years ago. And what seemed to be extraordinary to us is that the counter-terrorism operations led to more deaths than those that could be claimed by the terrorist organization themselves. These are civilian deaths. So what exactly are we trying to do? And this idea that through military approaches, you just do more of it and somehow it becomes more successful. I mean, it's very reminiscent of Vietnam in the 1960s up until the Tet Offensive, where the Viet Cong were just making their way south, and no matter what the United States was throwing at them, it wasn't working. And I think here we have to take, there's a cautionary tale. The way to deal with terrorism is to understand who the terrorists are, what their ideology is. It is an ideology that we need to understand. In the Islamic world, we have to engage deeper in how to undermine these organizations. And then also the response by governments needs to be very precise and needs to be laser-like in its application of the law, and no excess, and then a careful balancing of all the multi-faceted responses required in terms of how you deal with your society. And that we're not seeing as we should.
I wanted to talk about Yemen. You've, I think, issued a statement today, actually, on Yemen. I wanted to ask you that in terms of stereotyping, if you like. You are an Arab, and I think you come in for quite a lot of stick. It's very hard to find the good guys in the conflict in Yemen currently, and you've spoken out. How do you deal with those in Arab governments who say, but hang on, you shouldn't say that about us because you're one of us?
It is true that my background was one where I represented my country very proudly. But I take my office very seriously as a UN official. I don't show any favor. I don't defend, protect any particular country. I have said publicly that my own country barely speaks to me. I have no contact, not for 2 years. And I've been attacked in the press, almost seen portrayed as a traitor. And this is also in parts of the Arab press. But I think it's clear to me that the only way I could do my job is to be firm and fair with all countries. What we saw happening in Yemen once the aerial operations began was very clear to us because I have a large number of investigators in Yemen and in some of the worst areas at some of the worst times. I've had 2, for instance, investigators in Taiz. And so the information was coming to us, having only when we could corroborate, for instance, the details would we then acknowledge that this person's death was attributable to one side or the other. But it was very clear to us that the majority of deaths were as a result of the bombing by the coalition. And we protested directly. It was met with silence, and so we began to insist that there be an international investigation of this, and I continue to insist upon this, and I will continue to do it next week. I don't see nationality, religion, or any of that playing a part in this. I have a job to do together with my staff, and I think we take our job seriously. And when I look at the members of my staff in some of the most awful areas of conflict, and they have this courage which is so amazing to me, it encourages all of us to be like them. And on a point, just someone said to me, well, how do you find the energy to keep doing this when you're being attacked by all governments, basically? And what really keeps us going? Two things. One is the incredible heroism of human rights defenders, usually journalists and lawyers who are in extreme danger and yet still speaking on behalf of others, knowing what terrible things could be done to them. The other point, which is a hard point, is that the victims need us so desperately. And often if there's any stress in the work that we do in human rights, it's not from the governments who may oppose or argue the facts. It's from victims who want immediate deliverance or delivery from their suffering, and we can't do it. And this is the hardest thing for all of us, and I think all of us have been traumatized, probably still traumatized by it.
So how do you want to strengthen your office, the work of your commission? How could you do that now? Because it is a world, okay, I think if you do the sums, fewer people are dying than in wars in previous centuries, but we have more coverage and we see more deaths. How will you strengthen what you've got?
It's a good question. We are trying to diversify in the financial support, the basic financial support, because I don't think that governments will give us great increases. They probably think, this man and his team are loud enough. We don't want to give them those resources. So we need to look elsewhere. We are trying also to decentralize, to move staff and functions out of Geneva to the field where they need to be closer to those who need us. And the interesting thing is that not all governments oppose in the way that one thinks they oppose. So I'll give you an example. I go to a particular country where the foreign ministry will be defensive because it's their job to protect the reputation of the country. But if you go to the Minister of Interior, you go to the Minister of Women's Rights, or they will lay out all the problems in front of you. There's no defensiveness. I mean, I was once with the state prosecutor of a large country, an important country, and I outlined to him my concerns about what was happening with the police force and excessive use of force. And he looked at me and he said, High Commissioner, it's much worse than that. It's much worse than you think it is. And so there's an openness also in government. It doesn't always come from foreign ministries because they are not necessarily in the right frame of thinking about these issues. But often we see this on the ground, that there is a... So we need to increase our presence. We need to continue to build alliances. We need to continue to do the things that we're doing here, which is to speak out and to alert. The other thing that I forgot to mention is that when I do give lectures and speak, I'm always heartened by the number of young people who come after I've spoken and would say, how can we help? We work for a law firm. We want to do pro bono work. If you're filing an amicus in our particular country, we can help. And that sense of volunteering to help us is extraordinary. And that I find encouraging. And the other thing I find very encouraging is the head of BBC News, James Harding, told me at a meeting I had with him once. He said that when the BBC ran a survey, they found that youth in many parts of the world, they're very interested in technology, interested in culture and art and traveling. They're not interested in politics, but they are interested in rights. And I think there's where the future is for human rights. We need their support to continue to refine the mechanisms we have, to elect good people onto the committees that we have, to have good experts undertake very difficult work. You're threatened, and it's not an easy life, but it's a meaningful life. And that's what we see in the young and their willingness to contribute.
Well, we'll move to questions in just a moment. I just wanted to finish by giving you an opportunity. You've spoken in broad terms about this country, that country. You haven't named them necessarily. Just give us a success story.
Look, it would be difficult to find a country where the record is pristine. Let me take the Convention Against Torture, for instance. No country is going to tell you it violates the Convention. No country will tell you openly it violates the Convention. But there's no country that basically has abided by all the articles of the Convention. Yet there's a sense of shame that still occupies the international community. What worries me recently is that with the declarations made by Duterte in the Philippines and President Trump, is this sense of shame is beginning to disappear. We operate on the basic notion that there is shame. Whether you're a journalist or a human rights official, human rights defender, whether you work for the church or a humanitarian group, you hope by exposing a particular issue that shame will create a counter-reaction. It's not apparently still the case with some countries and in some leaderships. That has to be restored. It's difficult for me to cite a single country where across all the range of rights, civil, political, economic, social, and cultural, they're perfect. I've been to the Scandinavian countries. You know, on many of the markers, they are well ahead of others. But the migration issue really created a problem for us. When you rush through Parliament emergency legislation, which denies an applicant to political asylum the right to individual assessment, you're beginning to yourself put a hammer to the convention. And Europe was not tested in terms of its position as sentinel on human rights until we had the migration crisis. And alas, I think to many of us, it began to really wobble. Is there a country that was exemplary in all across the board in all issues? Difficult to say. Some are doing better than others, but it's dangerous to draw relative examples explicitly because then complacency sets in. And no government should be complacent. Just because you have a good constitution, good laws on the books, if you're not constantly investing all the time in ensuring that your state is compassionate, is humane, abides and respects the rule of law, you can go off the rails, as we've seen.
It's fascinating to talk to you. Thank you. Let's move to questions. If you'd like to ask the High Commissioner a question, this gentleman over here, and if there's a microphone to carry to him. Yeah, thanks so much. We've got about 15 minutes, I think. We started a bit late, so we can push things a bit. If you'd identify yourself first.
Thank you very much. Febrian Rudial from Indonesian Mission in Vienna. Prince Zeid, I think I would like to thank you for the very comprehensive yet thought-provoking briefing from you. And I guess I have to admit that this is one of the best sessions that I attended during the Bled session forum. My question is very short, is only one. Does your commission also do the review, not only for the state or country, but also for international organization decision? You know that I want to specifically mention about the decision by or resolution made by Security Council. Does your commission also do the review of the effect or the impact of the resolution on the Security Council? If I may, more specific, like a consolidated list, terrorist list, which sometimes does not have enough information on the person that put it in the list, but sometimes give more consequences for the daily life of the person who listed in the list. Thank you.
Yeah. It's a very good question. There is an ombudsperson, of course, for the Taliban Al-Qaeda list, the sanctions list that the sanctions committee that the Security Council runs. And where there have seen to be infringements on the human rights of those persons, the ombudsperson, who is a series of distinguished judges, they have intervened. It is a very good question that you ask. Have we looked at the other lists to see whether there have been unjustifiable infringements of people's rights when placed on the list? And I have to confess to you, I'm not aware of it. It may have happened. Special rapporteurs may have opined about it. And I will need to go and look. But it is a good question. You raised something else which I think is important. The UN cannot afford to be above it all. The UN makes mistakes, has made mistakes, and has the decisions that we collectively make or by omission don't make that lead to great harm, the organization has to acknowledge openly. And we're not very good at that. And we need to be. If we want governments to do it, we need to do it ourselves. But it is a good question whether we need to have more inward looking in terms of the human rights dimensions of this. And so I somehow need to get back to you. And you're in Vienna and you're with the Indonesian mission. So I hope, are you the ambassador? Yes, well, hopefully with a question like that, you should be ambassador. I'll recommend to Jakarta that I'll be hopefully in Jakarta sometime soon. Thank you.
Further questions, please? The gentleman here.
Hello, Brdoš, Ambassador of Ukraine to Slovenia. Mr. Commissioner, you have mentioned Ukraine. You know the situation in my country. Well, we are in the state of war during the 3.5 years. We have lost more than 10,000 people, more than 20,000 people are wounded. The number of the internally displaced persons reached already 1.8 million. You know the situation in Crimea? Well, because a number of reports were prepared. Well, the question is, what's your role? How do you cope with that task?
We do have, as you know, the periodic reports that we issue on Ukraine. We have a human rights monitoring mission there, very ably led. I intend to visit soon. We're also seeking access to Crimea, and we're pushing hard on that. I was in my previous capacity, I was in the Security Council when the crisis began. So I was very close to the details when they first emerged. And I hope with my own eyes to see what I need to see, not just to read from reports, but at some stage soon I hope to be there. I mean, clearly, you know, we not just need to shed light on the violations, but we need to examine the broader repercussions of this. And I think the General Assembly has been very clear on how it views Crimea. And it's that second resolution that guides my office. And we're very clear about it. And I've briefed the Security Council informally on Crimea before. So it remains a priority for us, both what happens in the East and in Crimea.
How much of a shame would it be, and you spoke about shame, were this issue to disappear from global consciousness and eventually become de facto a change of borders?
Well, it is dangerous because it clearly seems to be an attack on international law. And we've seen in the past what happens when we start to view actions of this sort. One hopes that there would be a recalibration of where all this leads. And again, you know, if you're scrambling just for what is important to you at the expense of others, the outcome is dire. And in an age where we have nuclear weapons in abundance. And prior to this life, I also worked on the Nuclear Security Summit as a Sherpa for my country, so I'm very well aware of the dangers of also fissile material working in radioactive isotopes of various sorts making its way to terrorist groups. You know, it's rather precarious. We need wisdom, and we need clear thinking, and we need a true commitment to maintain a global security presence which would be to the benefit of all and not to some, at the expense of others.
This gentleman here. It'd be nice if a woman asked a question.
Yeah.
It's been a bit male so far, but please, you don't have to change gender just yet. Could you identify yourself?
Thank you. Tobias Flessenkämper from the Centre International de Formation Européenne. I don't know where I want to go with this question, but I was very inspired by you, Commissioner, saying shame was a very important tool for maintaining an international human rights order. Now, there are lots of, those who may oppose this order who bring in the word of respect. So I feel very much we come into a discussion which is going around emotional concepts or rather psychological concepts and away from norms and how do we implement norms and standards and develop them and maybe fine-tune them and having some sort of rational governance system. Now, have we moved so far away from rationality already that it's beyond repair? That actually we need to only think about, how to get back into a situation where people feel shame rather than getting them back maybe to move towards rational approaches to managing their problems?
Yes.
If humanity wasn't so reliable, or unreliable, wasn't so unreliable or untrustworthy, we probably wouldn't need laws. Custom alone would guide us, and wisdom would guide us. But we're not reliable or trustworthy, and that's why we need laws, right? And without laws, we become even more unreliable and untrustworthy. The point behind what the populists are doing is they trigger the primordial reptilian instincts within us. And within all of us, we have bigotry. We have a sense of chauvinism. All of us. And all of us have to fight it daily. All of us are not perfect human beings. But those who fight for human rights are at least fighting the internal struggle. Those who do not fight for human rights have largely given up and exposed themselves to other potential justifications for their actions. And I believe that in a world, as you said, whipped up by emotions and hysteria, and I take your point, and it's a very good point, that am I not indulging in it myself? For the right reasons, perhaps, but still, am I not a hypocrite, if you will? And I accept that part of your argument. It would perhaps have merit if we didn't also send all the written communications to governments and sit there and say to them that there are violations of their obligations that they need to address. Or in participating in the Universal Periodic Review in the Human Rights Council, where every state submits its record to peer scrutiny, they don't take their obligations seriously. If we didn't do that, then I would say yes. Then I would say it looks like we are just engaging from a different point of view, but making the emotional arguments. And there is a danger to that. So I would say you're half right, but you're good in pointing it out because I need to be aware of it. So thank you.
Other points. Over here, please.
Question from Slovenia.
Hello, thank you very much. My name is Blanka Jamnišek. I'm an ambassador, but now situated in the capital. I deal with human rights education, and I believe that human rights education is one of the good stories, success stories, namely due to the World Program that started in 2005. There has been a number of countries that are doing human rights educations on a systematic way. This is also one of our country's priorities, namely human rights education, because we believe that people who know their human rights and learn to respect human rights of the others will probably be able to solve their differences and problems in a peaceful way. So I wonder what more could be done in this area to spread this kind of preventive action. And here I talk about building resilient societies, teaching children and youth about values, and we've been talking about values throughout this Bled Strategic Forum, in order to prevent future conflicts, which are multiplying, by the way.
Yes, I'm very glad you made that point, because I think it is very effective that education is missing still, isn't it?
Yes. It very clearly is a need where you can't even contest the grounds for why you wouldn't want to have it. Perhaps at a time it was seen as the purview of religious institutions to impart values and impart virtues, and that over time this couldn't remain so, and so an ecumenical curriculum, educational curriculum had to be imparted. But there was something quite remarkable that I learned a long time ago, and it came from representing an Arab country, dealing with the Arab-Israeli, the Israeli-Palestinian, the issue of occupation, dealing with these issues, and I felt that I needed to know more about the Holocaust. And so I picked up Lawrence Rees's book on Auschwitz. And in his book, there were two observations which really startled me. One is that 8 out of the 15 people at the Wannsee conference in January 1942 held PhDs. 2 was that when you looked at the ranks of the Nazi Party in the 1920s and 1930s, the profession best represented was the medical profession, followed by the teaching profession. There seemed to be no correlation between education and malevolence or wickedness. And so, is it really the case that we just want smarter, better read people, better engineers and doctors? I mean, we need people with a deeper sense of compassion. I worry about us moving from a post-truth to a post-compassionate period. And so we need exactly that, at a young age, for people to understand, as they're assembling the basic tenets of knowledge, what human rights are. But they need example. They need people who also speak out, and speak out about human rights as a matter of concern for everyone. Not just their own people, but everyone. And I think if we get to that point, we are making some successful strides forward. But it's very important, and thank you for raising it, Ambassador.
And that, I'm afraid, brings us to the end of our time. It's been, for me, very interesting. I hope for you too. Thanks so much for being very candid, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.